talking today about an interesting part of American history and Anglicanism and how they intersect, and an interesting argument and dispute that ensued from that moment in Anglican history in America. All right, so the story starts in the early 18th century. In Connecticut, the state of Connecticut was formerly well, it wasn't a state yet. It was just a colony. And the colony of Connecticut charter had what's called Congregationalism established as the official church of Connecticut. The Congregationalists were just Puritans, you might have heard that word before, or otherwise known as separatists, who had left the Church of England, become the Pilgrims, yada, yada, yada. Most of us know the story of the Pilgrims and of New England. But in 1722, after a Yale commencement speech, a number of Congregationalist clergy, I believe about 7, announced to their to the Yale faculty that they were questioning the validity of their ordination as Congregationalists and were going to seek Episcopal ordination back in England. So at this time, there were no bishops in the New World, so that meant literally going all the way to England and getting ordained as deacons and then as presbyters, and then getting sent back to America. There were about 7 of these Congregationalist clergy. The noteworthy ones were included the rector of the college, Timothy Cutler, as well as a tutor, Daniel Brown, a minister, Samuel Johnson, another minister, James Wetmore, who we'll be talking more about today, John Hart, who is also a minister, Jared Elliott, who's also a minister, and Samuel Whittlesley, who is also a minister. The people at the college did not take this very well, as you may imagine, and called it the Great Apostasy or the Dark Day. There was a lot of negative backlash against these ministers who were leaving the Congregationalist Church of Connecticut. At this time, there really weren't any Church of England parishes in Connecticut either. So all of these guys would end up, or I believe actually one of them died in England while trying to get ordained, but most of these guys would end up planting Church of England parishes, or what would eventually become Episcopal parishes in Connecticut. And so there was a lot of hullabaloo brought up by this whole situation, and it was called eventually even lovingly the Yale apostasy, or I think more honestly, the Yale converts. But basically, these folks were starting the Anglican Church in New England more honestly because of a serious conviction for Episcopal polity. This part of the American Church of England, what would become the Episcopal Church, was significantly more what we might call high church than lots of the rest of the Church of England in the New World. Because of this, and they were very convictionally defensive of Episcopal ordination. Once, for instance, America broke off from England, and those ordained as presbyters in the New World wanted to have an independent bishop from the Church of England. There were some Anglican ministers in the southern states, or not literally like the Mason-Dixon line southern, but southern of New England, who wanted to just elect a bishop, and then all of the presbyters would gather and lay hands on him, and some people were advocating for this. This is what the Methodists ended up doing under Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, and that's how they made their own bishops, even though Charles Wesley and John Wesley did not support this. Well, I believe actually John Wesley gave his approval, but Charles Wesley did not like it. It was the Connecticut folks and the people in New England in the Episcopal Church, or the nascent Episcopal Church, who insisted that they get their apostolic succession from a bishop in Britain. And they sent Samuel Seabury. Samuel Seabury tried really hard in London to get Church of England bishops to ordain him, basically failed, and had to go to the Scottish Episcopal Church in Scotland, which did ordain him as a bishop, laid their hands on him. I believe there was actually also a non-juring English bishop. I may be wrong about that. And that's how the Episcopal Church, or the American branch of the Anglican Church got their valid apostolic succession. And it was at the insistence, in large part, although they were not alone. There were obviously lots of Anglican ministers who wanted to be truthful and faithful to apostolic succession and episcopal ordination as it is held in the Anglican formularies um, throughout the entire Episcopal Church. But the Connecticut, New England brand tended to be much more dogmatic on it for this reason, dating back to this quote-unquote Yale apostasy. So when this caused a lot of stir at the time in 1722, people wrote polemics, and there was lots of debates, some of which I think we will find familiar if we're involved in the contemporary Protestant zeitgeist and debates, and if we're immersed in apologetics and polemics today, I think we'll find a lot of this familiar. So one of the instances of this debate was from a man named Mr. Hobart, who wrote against the Congregationalist ministers who left for the Church of England. So James Wetmore, who is one of the 7 Yale converts, wrote a defense of what they ended up doing, called A Vindication of the Professors of the Church of England in Connecticut. It's a funny title, but that's just how things were named at the time. And really, James is just trying to debunk the arguments put forth by this so-called Mr. Hobart. And Mr. Hobart, of course, I believe he's at Stanford, in Stanford, Connecticut, and he's also a Congregationalist minister, and he's trying to make arguments about why this was wrong. And so James Wetmore addresses them one by one. First of all, Hobart's central argument is that all ministers are equal, quote-unquote, fellow laborers, is the term that's used by the Bible, I believe, that he keeps insisting. So fellow laborers, Hobart says, means that there's no distinction within the ministers. You either are a minister of Christ or you are not a minister of Christ. There's no higher order, presbyter, bishop distinction. And Wetmore obviously disagrees. Hobart goes so far into arguing for this position that he argues that deacons are not actually ministers. Wetmore points out this is odd because the Greek word for minister actually comes from the word we use for ministry, and we often translate as ministry, comes from a very similar word in Greek. Regardless, this is just Hobart's argument to say that there's no distinctions, especially between presbyters and bishops, because, again, the central issue for the Yale converts was whether or not their ordinations as Congregationalist ministers were valid, and they said no, and that's why they had to leave. The other argument that Hobart makes is that there's only one minister, right? And that minister has the charisms of ministry, which are, the sacraments, discipline, government, basically. And technically, Hobart argues that the Church of England ordinations don't count. Why? And of course, Wetmore thinks this makes no sense, but basically, Hobart says someone can only confer powers they possess. Okay? And there's a right way to do ordination. So basically, Hobart says a minister can make another minister by conferring all of his ministerial power to the minister that he's ordaining. So all of the sacraments, basically, the right to baptize, the right to preside over the Eucharist. He doesn't really get into this, but I guess he does talk about this. So he doesn't think of the laying on of hands as a sacrament. I imagine Hobart doesn't. But Hobart says that the power to ordain is a power of a minister. And if a minister tries to ordain another minister, but doesn't believe they're giving that minister the power to ordain, they're not actually doing an ordination properly, Hobart argues. And so they're not actually ordaining presbyters. And that basically the only people who have valid ordinations in the Church of England are bishops, is Hobart's argument, because bishops, when they get ordained by another bishop, intend to confer the full gamut of the charisms and gifts of ministry to other bishops. Wetmore points out that if that was true, there'd only be, I think, 26 ministers in the Church of England. And that's obviously not a position he argues has ever really been taken, and that Hobart is kind of just adopting this position to contradict the Yale converts. But also, Whitmore points out this is obviously nonsensical. It is possible for anyone with any kinds of powers to confer fewer of those powers to someone else. So when someone, for instance, has the power of attorney, they give the legal rights that they actually possess to an attorney, but they don't give like their rights over their children to their attorney. They can give some powers and not others that they possess. That's obvious. And if a mutual consent, so this is the next thing he points out, is it's also possible for, even if what Hobart is trying to argue about the whole equality of ministers from the Bible, like that there's no distinctions given, all the ministers are equal. Even if that was true, which Wetmore does not believe is accurate, and he'll talk about that more later, it would also be possible for them to abdicate some of their powers for the sense of good government. So think about like just a regular association of people in a city will consent to a government, which means that they give up the power to break the law, basically, to governors. Governors get to make the laws and all this kind of stuff. They get powers that are conferred to them by other people who previously possessed those rights, giving them up to them. And then once you've rightly given those up, if you subject yourself to government in a civil sense, you do lose those authority, and you can't take it back. And actually, just by living in a society, you give up the ability to, say, murder somebody. That's not lawful anymore. You consent to the restriction on your rights in that sense, and your powers and abilities in that setting. And you can't lawfully do that anymore. And that's extremely legitimate. And governments consistently assume that they have the power to, delegate officers and do all these things to execute the law, but they only give these powers to those people and this power to that people. Like the police enforce the law, but they don't write the laws, and the legislators write the laws, but they don't enforce the laws. That's a very normal element of government. And if we really believe ourselves to be living in the kingdom of God, we would expect those elements of government to arise. Even if not by divine immediate institution, that they would arise naturally as functional necessities of the kingdom of God on earth, or of the church, and that they would still be binding. Okay. And that the actual reality would be, if that was true, right? If Hobart's whole argument about not, you either get the full ministry or you don't get the full ministry, were true, then basically nobody would have valid orders in the Congregationalist setting or in the Presbyterian setting. He talks about the renegado presbyters, which is a term I think it's funny that he uses. I don't know why he calls them that, but like the Reformation era presbyters who were ordained as presbyters or priests, but by bishops who did not intend to confer the fullness of the episcopate on them, then they started churches like in Scotland or the Netherlands, or say Congregationalist ministers. They didn't actually, if Hobart is correct, possess the fullness of the ministry, so they couldn't confer the fullness of the ministry. So it's clear that Hobart doesn't actually believe this and is just assuming it. And if he did try to enforce it regularly, it would destroy them. And again, Wetmore returns to his previous argument about how you can delegate certain authorities, not others, and argues that really Hobart is right that bishops don't intend to confer the specific charism of the laying on of hands, because that also relates to, say, confirmation, as well as it ordains to ordination. But when they don't give that charism or that gift to presbyters, presbyters do not possess it. They do not possess the ability to confer holy orders. And that gift, which has to be grounded in the institution of Christ, which he points to lots of places where, in like John 20:21, where Christ sends the apostles with the fullness of the authority, and he gives them, the same sending that he's got from the Father, right? So real powerful authority, the binding and loosing authority, he breathes on them, all that stuff. If it's not rooted in the apostles, then then how can we have real grounds for that charism or the belief in that gift as an authority or real power? And that is actually the question that led these Yale converts to leave for the Church of England. Wetmore points out. Okay. Then Wetmore points out, right? So some people object to the idea that the bishop is the biblical institution as the only power of laying on of ordinations. Although Wetmore has pointed out already that even if it wasn't, it would only be lawful for you to receive ordination from bishops. But he doesn't believe that, so he defends his actual position that it is biblical. And so when people point to 1 Timothy 4:14, for instance, which references that Timothy was ordained by a council of elders or a presbytery, isn't that checkmate? Isn't that saying, oh, look, presbyters ordaining presbyters in the Bible? And James Whitmore says, no, this doesn't necessarily make sense. So imagine there's a council of elders or a presbytery, which he points out, by the way, Congregationalists don't even have. So this would be an argument for Presbyterianism. But regardless, he says that it would include bishops because bishops are presbyters, and it would not exclude bishops. And so there were probably bishops or apostles there. And not only were there probably there, but we know that Paul was there, and Paul is an apostle. How do we know Paul was there? Well, in 2 Timothy 1:6, Paul references his having laid hands on Timothy. So we get a clear apostolic succession moment for Timothy from Paul. And Paul inconsistently, and in actually both 1 Timothy 4:14 and 2 Timothy 1:6, calls the laying on of hands an actual moment of gift giving. Like it is a charism has been bestowed on Timothy that he has to remember that he has, and that he can live into or not live into, in a way that people who have not had the laying on of hands do not have. Wetmore points out. Okay, so clearly this is at the very least, Wetmore points out, not contradictory to Scripture, but in fact, in actuality, it is the teaching of Scripture about how ordination works. Okay, so then he addresses Hobart's second argument about how there can't be distinctions in the ministry, and he points to the fact that presbyters in the Church of England have to submit to their bishops, and he says this is wrong, this is unbiblical, because there's that moment, right, where Jesus says, "Call no man father, call no one master but Christ." That debunks that oath. That's a bad oath. You shouldn't obey anyone but Christ. And Wetmore says, come on, be real. Nobody interprets those passages aggressively literally, except he says maybe some Quakers, right? People literally do call their own dads dad. So that would mean that there are some people you can call father. There are people who call other people master. I mean, at the time and even today, the term master was literally a title for people's last name. Okay, so you would call him Master Hobart, but it doesn't mean that he thinks he has the same authority as God. Okay, but that command is clearly just about do not give someone the authority that is due to God alone. Okay, that giving authority to a bishop does not undermine that. Believing in a hierarchy, respecting government, he says. If he argues that if someone was to take Hobart's assumed argument about bishops here and apply it genuinely to all Christians, which this passage is addressing all Christians, not just ministers, that it would exclude participating in government at all, which would make you an Anabaptist, which he says, obviously Hobart, as a Congregationalist, does not believe. So that's a very silly argument, he says. And he also points out that in Hebrews 13:17, we are explicitly commanded to obey ecclesiastical authorities. And if anything, if you think about it, right, that you can see how a lay person is commanded to obey an ecclesiastical authority, which again militates against this strict reading of call no man master. But also, if you think about it, if we all have to obey ecclesiastical authorities, and all ministers are equal and they don't have to obey any authorities, then what ecclesiastical authority are the ministers supposed to be obeying? So in an Episcopal polity, the deacons obey the priest obeys the bishop, and the bishop obeys the synod of other bishops. So there's no one bishop over other bishops. He argues this militates against the papacy as well. But they agree on the papacy, so he doesn't go any further into it, obviously. Hobart's next argument is actually, you guys, the Yale converts, are in schism because the Church of Connecticut is the Congregationalist church, and it's the established church. So you guys are harming, I think he uses the phrase, not just the coat of Christ, but the very body of Christ by separating. Wetmore says this is a good instinct. It's funny because the whole time he's like calling Hobart silly and stupid. But then here he says this is an actually really good concern to have about schism, and take schism very seriously. And he points to all the places where Jesus and the apostles call for unity and conformity. But he says there are some problems with this. First, this assumes that congregational churches are valid churches, which is the very issue at question, right? Because the Yale converts weren't saying, oh, I have a valid ordination, but I would like to be in this church. They were saying, we don't even have valid ordinations. So it's not really schisming if they didn't. The second thing is that if you want to say that they have an obligation to obey the Connecticut colonial government, how much more do they have an obligation to obey the English government and the English government's decisions about the church and all that kind of stuff? Okay, which is above the state or colonial government. Then he points out at the end that this would be a really good argument against the separatists. I mean, they're literally called separatists. So in the Church of England, the only reason Puritans exist is because they advocated for separating or schisming from the Church of England, even though they were in the Church of England. So if you are not allowed to leave the established church, then this would exclude the validity of Congregationalist churches. This doesn't make any sense. So obviously Hobart, again, he points out, doesn't really believe this and is only using this argument as a cudgel. And actually he points out he's only using this as a cudgel because he knows Anglicans take that criticism seriously about schism, and that they don't like schism, and that they have an obligation not to schism. And so he says that it's a dishonest tactic as it's being used by Hobart. Then the next argument Hobart makes is that Anglicans are immoral. He talks about going to islands where they're all Anglicans and there's no Congregationalists, and he says that they're all cursing all the time and drinking and being immoral. Which James Wetmore obviously says, like, come on, like, is this the best argument you can produce, is that Anglicans are just immoral people? I think it's interesting, though, because today, in the modern world, you'll actually get this argument pretty common about Anglicanism. Oh, but look at all the Anglican churches in the West or in all these different places, or the Episcopal Church, which are blatantly immoral. And they disavow the rules of God, all this other kind of stuff. And I think Wetmore's response still applies today. So what Wetmore says about the whole claim that Anglicans are immoral is that, even if they are disproportionately immoral in some way, which he doesn't necessarily concede, that they're not any more, or he basically says, in reality, they're not any more immoral than any other people group, but obviously you will find sinners in the correct church because it's the correct church. And that there's this delusion, he says, by separatists, that there will be this perfect communion somewhere where everybody is really amazing and flawless and morally virtuous. I'm going to read a little bit of a section of Wetmore's response directly here, because I think it very much applies to a lot of the ecclesial anxiety issues we get into today here on the internet. Okay. Wetmore writes, every new sect pretends a necessity of separating from the impure mass of mankind, and have the vanity to think themselves the only saints and darlings of heaven, and commonly they seduce well-meaning people into their snares by appearances of piety and pretenses to a more strict virtue than other people, upon whose faults and failings they are very sharp-sighted, and take pains to exaggerate in such instances as they have no great temptation to be like them in, or find their account in differing from, although, taking their whole practice together, they may have faults greater and vices more abominable. Whoever is acquainted with the rise and progress of the several sects in our own nation must know they have all been refiners of this sort, and yet turned out more and more impure. Basically, he argues that this is a Pharisaicalism. He points out elsewhere that this is exactly the admonition that that Pharisee gives, where he says, thank you for not making me like those sinners. And he says that Christ specifically says that man is not justified. And that's not how we should cast ourselves as secure is about our associations or affiliations. And then he says, if you really are convicted that there are some serious morality problems in practical Church of England parishes, he basically argues for an 18th century Reconquista mindset, which I think is pretty funny. But basically, he says that wherever there is a problem of this, if the issue is that moral men leave the Church of England, then that would only create more problems for those people in the Church of England who seek to be moral and seek to be biblical, which he says we should definitely do, and we all have an obligation to do. So the solution isn't separating. The solution isn't retreating. He says it's instead it's staying because of just moments ago. Hobart talked about all the problems of schism, and Wetmore totally agrees that those are problems of schism. He also clarifies that every man, he goes on to talk more and more eloquently about the reasons to be specifically in the Church of England, right? Which he calls the Catholic Church or the Church of England. He doesn't call it Anglicanism. Anglican isn't really a word that's being used. But basically, he says every man inherits an obligation to be in the Catholic Church, okay? That is just the plain obligation. So nobody has to obey any authority that tells them to leave the Catholic Church, Wetmore says. So like if your parents, which are a lawful authority, told you to become Muslim, you wouldn't have to become Muslim because this primary obligation to be in the Catholic Church supersedes that, which Hobart hinted at with his whole accusation of schism. The second authority, though, would be a submission to the jurisdiction that you're in. He talks about nations as valid jurisdictions. He doesn't go into it as much, but you might say something like what Richard Hooker argues, which is contextualized. Nations are particular. They have their own rules and their own customs. They have to be argued. They have to be administered differently than other nations. So you have to figure out what nation you're in, basically, and then say, okay, does my nation, in this case, the Church of England, again, it's 1722, so Church of England still controls the New World. Is it in the Catholic Church would be the next question. And if the answer is yes, it is in the Catholic Church, then therefore you would be obliged to join the Church of England. He says the difference between this and some heretic country, where he agrees would be different, would be the answer to the question, is the jurisdiction of the church that the government wants me to be in the Catholic Church? If the answer is no, then yes, of course, you wouldn't obey the government in that situation. But he points out that Hobart has not proved at all that, say, the Church of England is a pagan church or it's abandoned the gospel or anything. He's just making weird, harebrained arguments about ordination, which aren't even legitimate. And he says that at the core of this question is those questions about ordination and valid authority and all these other kinds of things. So when in Hebrews 13:17, Paul tells the congregation, or the author of Hebrews, if you don't think it's Paul, exhorts the congregation to obey their authorities, their earthly authorities, the ecclesiastical authorities on earth. Who is he talking about? Where are they for me? That's the question you should be asking when you read that. How can I obey them? And that's exactly what he argues that the Yale converts were doing. And that is good. And then he says, okay, but basically the next question is, what about the Church of Connecticut, or the Congregationalist Church in Connecticut that Hobart's a part of? Are they a part of the Catholic Church? And Wetmore basically says no. And that was his conviction. That's why they left. So he says that the Congregationalists, especially in Connecticut, have allowed periodically lay ordinations. This means there was no valid laying on of hands, even from presbyters to other presbyters in Connecticut. So he doesn't go into the question of whether or not he thinks ordination from presbyters would have been valid. But even if you accept a presbyterial succession, he says the Congregationalists don't even have that because they haven't held that consistently, and they've allowed for lay ordinations, which means that even under Hobart's strained argument that he started out with, right, about how ministers have to ordain other ministers with the fullness of the charism of ministry, or they're not valid ordinations, even under Hobart's test, that the Congregationalist Church in Connecticut is not valid and doesn't have valid authority. He also goes on to point out that when talking about the legitimacy of the puritanical movement or the Congregationalist movement, Hobart cites the Reformation Fathers as being heroes and really talks very positively about them, and talks about Luther and the early Reformed folks, and especially those Church of England reformers. And then Wetmore points out, hold up, you're claiming these guys on your side, but really they were Anglicans, and they're the ones that created the Anglican Church. So if they're these heroes, those guys set up the doctrines that we obey now as Anglicans. They reformed the Church of England into those doctrines. So if there really are heroes, then by that logic, Hobart, he concludes, you should also join the Church of England, and everyone should. And he basically says that he kind of does the fullness of the faith argument, right? That the Anglican tradition has the fullness of the faith, and that for the greatest clarity, the greatest assurance, everyone should be a member of the Church of England, especially in the Americas where they claim to be Englishmen, he says. So that was a summary of James Wetmore's argument and vindication of the professors of the Church of England in Connecticut, and a little bit of a brief American history story about the Yale converts, as they're called. And I think that is just super interesting. I think hopefully you guys can see why I think there were a lot of insights provided from this particular situation in American history to a lot of the debates we have today online and between denominations, and as Anglicans, and what is the Anglican ecclesiological perspective, etc., etc. If you like the video, If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to leave a nice review. If you want to see more of my YouTube content, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, Young Anglican. Hit the little bell button and you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. If you want to hear some more products of Anglican Renaissance, we've uploaded 3 audiobooks to the YouTube page Anglican Renaissance Library that are readings from the opening essays in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. And we hope to upload lots more audiobooks onto Anglican Renaissance Library soon. We've also launched AnglicanRenaissance.org, so you can see more about what Anglican Renaissance is about. And Anglican Renaissance is growing. If you want to get involved, if you want to help, go to the website. There's a little contact us thing at the bottom. Be sure to help in any way you can and to show your support. All right. If you really want to support just me, specifically Joe, Young Anglican, I have a locals page. younganglican.locals.com is where you can find me, and you can support me if you really feel that's necessary. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and God bless.